Yeah, it's not a simple explanation. There are treaties that govern international convention, international agreements between the countries that relate to controlled substances or that relate to substances that are seen as having a risk to the health of the public. And there are three main treaties that were formed between nations that govern the movement of certain plants that are controlled and certain substances that are controlled. There was a convention in 1961, which was the first global agreement that relates to the use of different plant materials. And it largely covered three plants, the cannabis, the coca, and the opium. So there was a treaty formed because of concern about the way that these particular plants were perceived at that time as being potentially harmful. The governments of the world made an agreement in 1961 about how they were going to be controlled. And that's where this international body of controlling substances and controlling how they're to be used or licensed or prohibited and what the penalties would be, that's where that began to become formed in terms of the global community. Then in 1971, there was a refinement to this initial convention, which was the recognition that there were psychoactive substances that were being created chemically and synthetically that also had an effect on public health or a potential effect on people's psychological or development. And so there was another treaty that was developed at that time, which was called the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances. And in that treaty, they listed a bunch of psychoactive compounds, including LSD. And among them, they listed a substance called dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. And dimethyltryptamine, in many preparations of what people call ayahuasca, is something that could be found. It's naturally occurring. It occurs in many plants. And so as a result of its presence in the ayahuasca brews, it's considered by many countries to be a subject of international control. Now, the same treaty had a footnote and an explanation to it, which described that there were certain plants that had a ritual use, in the actual term was in magical and religious rites. And it said that where there is a known history of use within these ceremonial activities, that the plants themselves are not controlled. And it gave three examples of three different plants. One was the psilocybin mushroom, one was the peyote cactus, and the other was a plant called Mimosa hostilis. And it listed the tribes that used each of these plants within their magical and religious rites. Turns out that Mimosa hostilis is a plant that comes from tribes use it here in Brazil, and it contains dimethyltryptamine. So in the very treaty that that was developed some 25 years ago or 35 years ago now, 35 years ago, no, 71, 45. The same treaty that was developed 45 years ago, there was already a recognition that there was a use of a plant from this country, from Brazil, that contained dimethyltryptamine, and they specifically said that its ritual and ceremonial use was not controlled by the treaty. And then in 1988, there was another treaty that was formed that didn't add new substances that I remember, but refined some of the systems of control between the different countries. So this is by international agreement how these substances are to be administered or controlled around the world. And the treaties also say that these were minimum levels of control, that the countries were free to adopt controls that were greater, but they weren't free to adopt controls that were less. That was part of the way of unifying the world's view of how to work with these very powerful substances. So you have countries, for example, where there are certain substances that are subject to very grave criminal prosecution controls, where you could be imprisoned. There's other countries where the same substance could lead you to be put to death. And so there's a range of different responses to the use of different psychotropic substances. And there's also different traditions. You know, there's a tradition in certain parts of the world that doesn't exist in other parts of the world, where maybe they're using a plant that has a psychotropic effect on it, but it isn't even known to the world authorities because it's in a very small context with a small population. Under the systems of control that exist, there are exemptions that can be given for different medical uses. Also, scientific research is another area that there's a provision for under international law, because there's a recognition that many of these substances may have healing uses or may have therapeutic uses or beneficent uses, and research is something that we could help find out what those uses are. And so, although there are these systems of controlling these substances, there's a provision for medical research to be done. And so there's procedures that somebody could go apply in our country to the DEA or in other countries to the health ministry, and to get a license to be able to experiment using a psychoactive controlled substance. So every country has its own laws, and the laws that relate to ayahuasca typically depend on how they interpret the part of the convention that relates to dimethyltryptamine. There are countries that treat anything that contains dimethyltryptamine as being controlled itself. There's other countries that have the idea, if it comes from a plant that happens to contain dimethyltryptamine and the plant isn't controlled, then the substance itself isn't controlled too. So it depends on what the understanding of each country is.
Ciao, ciao.